Joining our discussion now is Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And Mayor Buttigieg, I just want to say to you that it is very clear to me that your eloquence and insight is such that any question by me would be presumptuous. America just wants to hear what you have to say on this historic day.
You know, it's actually hard to find the words on this day because this is of such deep significance. The American people spoke, and the American people decided that it's time to turn the page. In so many ways, the thing I keep reflecting on is that Joe Biden, even during these last interminable few days, was already setting about the work that's going to define his presidency, which is to heal and to unite. That's been his instinct throughout. And that's work that really began long before we came to this point. If you just think about the coalition that he built, progressives, moderates, independents, a healthy number of what I love calling future former Republicans, and maybe they're just former Republicans now, that delivered this historic majority for change. I don't think any of us are under any illusions about the challenge that he's going to face. In terms of the public health crisis, the economic crisis, the crises of racial and economic justice, climate, and democratic legitimacy itself. But this is a good day for the United States of America. This is a day that we remind ourselves that there really is a powerful American majority for something so much better than what we've been living with these last 4 years.
You know, I got to meet Joe Biden as a Senate staffer working on the Democratic side of the Senate, and so working in alliance and support of him every day. You got to meet him in such a different way as a political opponent in a campaign. You got to take the measure of the man in such a different way, and yet I feel that from our different meeting points with him, we came to the same conclusion about his decency and about his genuine interest in reaching out to people, especially when I used to watch him on that debate stage during some of those breaks, where he would be shaking hands with you. He would be going over and finding that personal moment with each of those people who he was standing in campaign opposition to on that stage.
It's true. It's amazing when you feel like you're coming to appreciate and respect somebody more and more while you're competing against them. I mean, it shows you the kind of guy that he is. And you could feel that it was authentic. All of those moments, including, by the way, I mean, it's one thing to be gracious if you're coasting through and you've got, a few competitors nipping at your heels. But including in the moments when he looked like he was on the back foot, he was just as gracious then as when he was building the commanding lead that brought him to the nomination and now has made him president-elect. He's somebody who just cares about other people, wants to know what's on your mind, wants to get to know you. He would talk with me when he had every reason to be irritated and condescending just by my presence on that stage. He would talk to me the same way as he would talk to people he served in the Senate with for years. And he would talk to the stagehands or the people in backstage kind of manning the crew the same as he would any of us who were up there on that debate stage. That's the kind of person he is. And I think those qualities not only helped him earn the presidency, but they're going to be so important for him in the presidency because that simple regard for other human beings. It's not written down anywhere as a job requirement or a job function of the presidency, but it might be the most important part, that undocumented, unofficial, unwritten role of the president, especially given the presidency he's going to be following.
You met Kamala Harris in that same dynamic of opponents in a campaign. And so you're in a position to actually feel and know what it's like and what they are like as a team, what they may combine to be like as a team in dealing with resistance, in dealing with opposition, in dealing with disagreement. What do you anticipate us seeing in that next year, since they're obviously going to be dealing not just with disagreement from Republicans in Congress, but there will be disagreement within the Democratic Party?
There will. There's no question that there are going to be a lot of competing forces, and there are a lot of expectations. left, right, and center, there was a ton of expectation for this administration to deliver the best results ever under what will be some of the worst circumstances ever to arrive into. One of the things that really has struck me with Kamala Harris, and by the way, we cannot overstate just the extraordinary historic significance of her election as vice president. But one of the things I think is really striking about her is something you saw on that debate stage as she was handling all of the sort of alternate reality arguments coming from Mike Pence, which is a remarkable combination of firmness and warmth that I think is going to be especially important for her as a leader going forward. She's well known for her kind of brilliant work on those Senate committees, and there's the idea of kind of being able to poke holes in arguments. But now she's leading, or she'll be representing and teaming up with a President Biden in his leadership. And I think what they'll both share and what they'll both be able to work through in a way that I'm really looking forward to witnessing is identifying the difference between bad faith opposition and genuine disagreement. Because when there's genuine disagreement, look, Joe Biden's the kind of guy who's going to want to try to find the common ground and build the biggest coalition possible. But when there's bad faith opposition and resistance, which we know is going to be, if history is any guide, a major feature of a GOP Senate, especially if it's a McConnell majority Senate. Not that we've accepted that that's going to happen, given how exciting Georgia's about to get. But regardless, I think they'll be able to sniff that out and really have a direct conversation with the American people about what's at stake, because there really is a powerful mandate. Think about it this way. All of the stated priorities of the Biden-Harris ticket are things that the American people really want to see happen, including a striking chunk of the people who didn't even vote for the Biden-Harris ticket. So whether we're talking about climate action, racial justice, raising wages, fair tax code, these are things that the American people really do want to see. And I think they're going to have a great instinct for rallying the American people and unifying us to get behind it. And at the same time, frankly, putting those who stand in the way on the spot to explain why they would face down the American people and get in the way of that.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.